I hauled my butt to the laundromat on a typical gray Sunday morning at 7. I had no idea if it was a gray day outside, but I guess that's how they all feel when you're in the laundromat on a Sunday morning. I have only been using a laundromat for the last year or so. Before that, my wife did laundry in our own laundry room in the basement of our house. I moved about a year ago, and 6 months ago my wife became my ex-wife, and the laundromat was now located in my former home. So on Sunday early morning, I headed to the laundromat located about a mile from my apartment. While I don't really like getting up early to do laundry, I didn't want that ritual to interfere with my weekend, so I got to the laundromat early and left early. I avoided the hassle of waiting for the machine on a busy day and having to engage in polite conversation with other visitors. After all, isn't Sunday morning meant for hangovers and quietly reading the paper? I'd been going to the same laundromat for the past 9 months or so, and I'd probably seen her before but never paid attention to her. But this time was different. One of the wheels on the cart she was pulling seemed to be a little bent, causing the cart to roll unevenly. It was piled high with dirty clothes, and she was having trouble rolling it behind her with one hand and trying to hold the door open with the other. I saw this while looking at the sports section, and being a generally nice guy, I put the paper aside, walked to the door, and held it for her like a gentleman while she pulled the wagon inside. She looked up at me and gave me a 100-megawatt smile with beautiful white teeth and big brown eyes. "Thanks, mister," she said, heading toward the row of washing machines against the far wall of the laundry room. I estimated her to be about 7 or 8 years old, mixed race or possibly Hispanic, with a mop of long, curly brown hair. She was just adorable. I turned around, expecting to see my parents walking behind me, but they were gone. Now I was alarmed and intrigued. I watched the child load the entire stack of clothes into the washing machine, not separating the colored from the white as I had been taught. Then she added some laundry detergent she was carrying in a cart, put the money in the machine, and pressed the start button. She took a little teddy bear out of her bag, sat on a chair and talked quietly to it while the washing machine did its work. From my seat almost at the other end of the laundry room, I could see that her clothes jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, and a pink jacket too light for a 20-degree morning had seen better days. Though they weren't dirty, they were faded from age and wear. She looked only a step above a street hobo, but there was a calmness in her demeanor that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I also could not believe that parents could send such a young child alone to wash the whole family's clothes. Being a parent myself, I realized that something was wrong with all of this. It brought me back to my own transaction. My children at this very moment were probably asleep, snuggled up in their warm, comfortable beds in my former home. When they wake up, probably an hour or two later, their mother, my ex-wife, will probably have a hot breakfast of pancakes and eggs and maybe bacon ready for them. My 13-year-old son, Ethan, is a big fan of bacon, and my 15-year-old daughter, Haley, prefers pancakes. My favorite meal was waffles, but those days of happy Sunday morning breakfast with my family have become quickly fading memories. As is customary in a divorce, my wife was awarded custody of the children, and although I was granted some visitation rights, my wife with all her nastiness turned the children against me, blaming my selfishness for the destruction of our family. My children wanted nothing to do with me, and it was quite obvious the few times we were together. My crime: I couldn't bear to watch my wife cuckold another man during a long weekend with 3 other couples, and the man she ended up having sex with, a rich guy who had a habit of having sex with other men's wives. She and he devised a plan whereby they were to have sex for one night, and then she would come back to me and be completely faithful to me for the rest of our lives, as she had been for the rest of the weekend. Since she had told me about it beforehand, it wasn't cheating, she claimed, but just in case I wanted to make a fuss, she would take half my money, half my stuff, the whole house, and as a nuisance, mess up my relationship with my kids, which of course would go to her. When I refused, she got everything she promised, and of course she blamed it on me. The kids bought it. I was totally screwed. Thinking about those family breakfasts made me hungry, because I hadn't eaten anything since the last sausage had slipped down my throat, along with a malted Mickey at the bar where I'd watched the Knicks game. There was a poor imitation of a vending machine hanging on one wall and a Coke machine next to it. I was sure the owner of the laundromat collected money from both machines every day, or they would have been broken into and ruined long ago. I bought a pack of M&Ms and a Diet Coke. Just as I was picking up the can of Coke, I glanced over at the girl. She seemed to be calmly watching me, but then I realized she wasn't looking at me, but at my snacks. Like I said, I'm someone's father, and the look on her face as she looked at my snacks hurt my heart. I walked over to where she was sitting and quietly asked if she wanted a Diet Coke and M&Ms. She visibly brightened up and sat up straight in her chair. Then, with a sad expression on her face, she declined my offer. My mom says I shouldn't take food from strangers, especially men, she explained. That's a very good rule, honey, and you should always listen to what your mommy says, I agreed. I'll tell you what. I'll just put the sodas and M&Ms on the chair next to you and you can have them if you want them. And I'll get another for myself and go back to my seat. I set the snacks aside, went back to the vending machines, and bought myself another Diet Coke and another bag of M&Ms. Then I went back to my seat and picked up a newspaper, surreptitiously watching her from above. After about 5 minutes, she picked up the soda and M&Ms and got down to business. I smiled to myself. I left about 90 minutes later, having folded my 2 loads and stowed them in the car. As I left, I didn't think about the baby, immersed in my own life and how I was going to spend the rest of Sunday. To be honest, I didn't think of the baby again until I got to the laundromat the following Sunday, again around 7 a.m. Then I wondered if she would show up again. Sure enough, about half an hour later she came to the door, again dragging a cart loaded with clothes behind her. I held the door for her again, and after thanking me, she headed for the machines against the far wall. I noticed that she was wearing the same clothes as last week. I waited until she started to load up and then cautiously walked over and sat down in the seat next to her. I see you have a problem with the rear tire of your wagon, sweetheart. Is it okay if I try to fix it? She nodded affirmatively, playing with her bear cub. I turned the wagon over and saw that the right rear wheel was bent on the axle. I straightened it with my hands and then rolled the wagon back and forth to check my work. Instant fix for the wagon! My little friend looked impressed. I'm Alex Rogers, by the way, I said, extending my hand for a handshake. She extended her small hand with as much dignity as she was capable of, and said in a somber voice, Maddie Ruiz. Very pleased to meet you, sir. Well, now that we've introduced ourselves, we're no longer strangers, I said. What do you say to sodas and candy? Can I have a real Coke this week? She asked, looking at me questioningly and wide-eyed. Sure. 1 real Coke for you, a Diet Coke for me, and some M&Ms for both of us. We sat and talked for almost 2 hours. I took a notebook and pen from the car and introduced her to the game of tic-tac-toe. It took her about 5 minutes to get the hang of the game, but then she started getting the hang of it. I let her win a few times, just like I let my kids win sometimes. For a minute or two, I was immersed in my own little world, thinking about playing games with my kids. Then I thought about my then-wife Tracy, looking me straight in the face and telling me she was going to sleep with Robert Goldstein III, the big city lawyer, the night my life as I knew it ended. It's just one night, Alex. It won't mean anything. It'll just be sex. What? Are you kidding me? This isn't going to be just sex. This is going to be the end of our marriage, I yelled back at her. Don't be like that, Alex, she shouted back. Don't throw away 18 years of marriage over one night. I didn't sneak around behind your back like I could have. We could have done this and you probably never would have known. Just give it to me, Alex. Tracy took Robert's hand and walked away with him to his bedroom in the 4-room cottage. After standing there with my mouth open for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a minute, I gathered my things and left. Alex, it's your turn, Maddie said, bringing me back to the present again. I marked an X in one of the side squares, and that gave Maddie a chance to get 3 O's in a row diagonally to win. She made her best face of triumph by marking a line through her triple. High five, kid, I said, holding my hand out at arm's length from her. She gave me a sideways glance, then stood up in her chair and was able to reach my hand to complete the high five. Gotcha, she said. I stayed in the laundry room until Maddie's clothes were finished and folded. I offered to give her a ride home, but she said she couldn't accept because it was Mom's rules. Mom is a smart woman. I'd like to meet her sometime, I said. Well, maybe someday. She doesn't go out too often, Maddie replied. I continued this routine with Maddie as winter turned to spring and spring to summer. I started packing a small bag with sandwiches for both of us and snacks, and I bought soda from the laundromat. I wasn't really hungry at this time, but I figured if I ate a sandwich, she would too, and she was awfully thin. So I started packing an extra sandwich, telling her she could take an extra home for her mother. She never protested at all and always thanked me. By then, she had told me that she was really 7 years old and would be a second grader at our neighborhood elementary school in the fall. Her father wasn't home, and in truth, Maddie told me that she had never met her father. Her mother apparently worked part-time outside the home while Maddie was in school, though she didn't know what exactly. But by the time Maddie came home from school, she was always home. She and her mother mostly stayed in their apartment, occasionally going out to the park when the weather was nice. Mostly they watched TV, and Maddie was familiar with almost every animated movie that the children's channels had recently shown. I couldn't name the first one. There was no money for extras, but her mother would sometimes go out on Saturdays, leaving Maddie after dinner with instructions to go to bed at 9 p.m. She would go to bed. On Sunday morning, her mother would wake her up, give her money for one washer and one dryer, and send her to the laundromat with her wagon. Truth be told, my life wasn't much better than Maddie's at the moment, though at least I had enough money to live on. With alimony, mortgage payments, and child support, my salary as a top programmer left little opportunity for extra time, usually a rare sit-down at a bar with my buddies. I didn't date at all. I didn't miss it. I did miss my kids, though, at least until I remembered how they treated me after Tracy and I broke up. I preferred to think of happier times with them, but reality always seemed to jump up and bite me. "Where the hell are you?" screamed Tracy when I picked up the phone in my house the morning after I left Robert Goldstein's lake house. The phone showed it was 10:06. For all I knew, it was 2:13, and I was tipping another shot of Eagle Rare bourbon into myself. I must have eventually staggered to the bedroom and fell asleep. "You left me at the lake house." "How do I get home?" She screamed at me again. "Screw you! Let Robert Goldstein III take you home." I hung up while she was still yelling something. Damn, you can't hang up as abruptly with a cell phone as you can with a landline. In the old days, I would have smashed the phone against the wall by slamming it down. The following Sunday, Maddie showed up at the laundromat 15 minutes later than usual and without her bag of clothes. Tears were streaming down her young face, and I thought she must have been robbed. She was carrying her teddy bear, clasping it under her right arm. "Mom didn't come home last night, and I don't have money for a washing machine," she said when I approached. "She doesn't come home sometimes?" I asked as gently as I could. She shook her head negatively, tears glistening in her big brown eyes. "Mom always comes home. That's another one of her rules." I calmed her down and gave her the food I had brought with me. I was in new territory and didn't know what to do. "Is there anyone you can stay with until your mom gets home?" I asked. She shook her head again, this time with a mouthful of peanut butter and jelly. I knew I couldn't leave her alone in the apartment, but if I called the police without a plan of action, they would probably send her to foster care within a day and possibly take her away from her mother permanently if they thought she wasn't taking good enough care of the child, which I already doubted. "How about we go to your apartment and leave your mom a note saying we're at my apartment? She can call me when she gets home and I'll bring you to her." I could see her wheels spinning. It was a violation of one of her mother's rules, but since her mother wasn't coming home, I don't think she wanted to spend the day alone in her apartment. Finally, she nodded in agreement. After packing up my things and putting them in the car, we went to her apartment first. We didn't pack anything in Maddie's apartment because there just wasn't anything to pack. The few articles of clothing she had, she was either wearing or they were lying amongst the dirty clothes waiting for their turn in the laundry room. I told her we would stop somewhere and I would buy her a few things, including a new toothbrush and comb. She smiled sadly. I left a note with my name and number on the middle of the small kitchen table, and then we went to get things for Maddie. I let her pick out a few tops and pairs of jeans and underwear and socks at the nearest Dollar General store. While she seemed thoroughly enthralled, I was trying to figure out what I should do if her mom didn't return quickly. We watched cartoons and the Disney Channel. I made us lunch and dinner and put her to bed at 9 in my spare room on the couch. The next day I planned to call her into work and take a personal day to take care of some business. Maddie and I waited until lunchtime to go back to her apartment on Monday, but there was no sign that anyone had been there after the two of us the day before. I rummaged around the apartment a bit and found a drawer in her mother's dresser that contained papers. Among the useful items was Maddie's birth certificate, which I noticed didn't have her father's name on it. Her mother's name was Fiona Ruiz. I took the birth certificate along with a picture of Maddie and her mother. The picture was probably taken when Maddie was about 2 years old. She looked a little more than a toddler. They were hugging in front of the camera. Fiona looked to be in her early 20s and had the same long, curly brown hair as Maddie. Both were smiling for the photo, and although Fiona was a beautiful woman, she still had a tired, sad look in her eyes. I wondered if that look had grown over the past few years. Maddie watched as I carefully went through her mother's things. I tried to make light conversation with her and explained that I was looking for something that might help us find her mother. She seemed to accept this. When we got back to the apartment, I turned on the TV to the Disney Channel and put Maddie down, and then I went into the bedroom and called the police and reported Fiona Ruiz missing. I didn't have much to say to the officer who took the call. Basically, I felt that something must have happened to her for her to leave her child alone. "Is the child alone in the apartment right now, sir?" the officer inquired. "No, she's with me. I'm as close a friend as I can be to a child. I'd be happy for her to stay with me until things are resolved. If you would agree to do this until you are contacted by child services, we would appreciate it." I was worried that Maddie would end up in foster care. No one I knew who had been in foster care spoke well of the system. I knew I could do the right thing if I was allowed to keep her. As I pondered this, from somewhere in the back of my brain, I remembered that my boss's wife, Darlene, has influential friends in the social services industry. Maybe I could extort a favor. I'd like to think that my boss and I were on good terms. I worked for him for 20 years and did a heck of a job for his company. We always got along well on a personal level as well, and during the divorce he and his wife supported me. Darlene Laster showed up at my apartment about 20 minutes after I talked to her husband. Said she wanted to make a new friend. I introduced her to Maddie, and like the Pied Piper, Darlene had charmed the girl in 5 minutes, and vice versa. When she left about an hour later, I hugged her and promised her that she would do everything in her power to keep Maddie with me. 2 policemen came to my apartment that day. They didn't hold out much hope of finding Fiona Ruiz. I gave them a copy of a picture of Maddie and her mom. On Tuesday, I went back to work, took Maddie with me, and enrolled her in our company's preschool. Darlene helped organize it about 15 years ago. I never used it for my kids because Tracy stayed home until the kids became independent after school. But for me, playing single dad, it was a godsend. At least until school started, I would take Maddie to work with me in the morning, have lunch with her at noon, and take her home at night. All in all, it was really nice. Having Maddie with me helped me get over being abandoned by my own children. We rarely saw each other, and when we did, we usually just had dinner at one of the local restaurants. I didn't take Maddie with me when I went out with my children, leaving her with my neighbor, Mrs. Olivares. They didn't need to show her how they felt about me. Maddie was a breath of fresh air for me. Due to lack of funds, she and her mom hardly ever went out of their house, so a lot of what I did with Maddie was a new experience for her. The first time we went to a real restaurant instead of some McDonald's, she was mesmerized like someone who had just come from another planet. When we went to the park and stopped to eat a pretzel and have a soda after she played on the playground, you'd think I was inviting her over for tea. I think she was smiling for a week after the first time. I know I was smiling for a week after that, just listening to her exclamations about the experience. She started teaching me Spanish. Apparently, she was bilingual and laughed a lot when I got words and phrases mixed up. One time at McDonald's, I ordered a horse meat and a Coke, and she laughed so hard she started crying. In her innocence, it never occurred to her that most people are not bilingual. I kept her at the same school where she went to first grade because it was easiest for the school system. I had her birth certificate, so they didn't ask too many questions when I listed myself as her contact person and my apartment as her address. I never heard back from the police about Maddie's mother or from the social service agencies that wanted custody of Maddie. Darlene must have twisted someone's arm for me, or the city just decided they had too many loose ends to worry about me and Maddie. My cooking skills also improved because when Maddie stayed with me, snacking on pizza and beer was unacceptable, so we started watching cooking shows on the Food Channel and cooking together in the kitchen. I had never done this with my kids because Tracy, I have to admit, was a great cook. But with my Maddie's help, I was learning and getting better, and we had a lot of fun in the kitchen. I'm not going to lie and say that everything was perfect. We had our spats and problems, just like any other family. But that's just the way it was, just like any other family. We'd only been together a little over a year, and Maddie and I had already turned into our own version of a family. And it was pointed out to me at the school Maddie attends at the beginning of 3rd grade. We were at a school open house one evening and were walking down the hallway when one of Maddie's friends and her parents came over to say hello. Maddie's friend introduced her parents as my mom and dad, and then Maddie introduced me as her dad. I hadn't even thought of our family in those terms, and when she called me her dad, I nearly fainted with incredible joy upon hearing those words. I choked for a second, and I had to apologize to the Reynoldses for my momentary silence, saying I had a piece of snack stuck in my throat. Maddie caught it, looked at me sideways, and squeezed my hand. She never called me Alex again, and nothing could please me more. I was having so much fun being a parent again that I hadn't even noticed that I hadn't even met her in over 2 years when Maddie brought it up at the grocery store one day. We were walking up and down the aisles, filling a cart with groceries from our shopping list, when we passed a short woman in the produce department. I didn't pay much attention to it, but Maddie looked at the woman with redoubled intensity as we passed her. "Wow, Daddy, that's a very beautiful woman." "You should ask her out," Maddie said. I was going through my shopping list when she made that statement, so I immediately stopped the cart and looked closely at the woman we had just passed. She was beautiful. Then she looked up at me and we smiled embarrassedly at each other. "Well, aren't you going to say something to her, Daddy?" asked Maddie, looking at us. At this point, I wanted the floor to swallow me up, but hell, maybe the woman would give Maddie and I a pass, so I tried it the old-fashioned way. "Hi, I'm Alex, and this is Maddie. As you just heard, Maddie thinks I should ask you out on a date or something," I stammered. "What do you think?" she asked, looking me straight in the eye and bestowing me with $1,000,000 smile. I was completely blown away. Caramel-colored skin, beautiful white teeth, a smile that could melt ice. And my heart. She looked to be about 5'2", 110, maybe 35 years old. And although she was wearing a light jacket, she seemed to have curves in all the right places and fit well in jeans. There was no ring on her left hand. I quickly wondered if Maddie had noticed that. "Would you like to have dinner with us one night?" "All of us. Or just you and me if you want." "Mueve suavemente, Romeo," Maddie said teasingly in Spanish. "It was a great move to ask your daughter to look for single women in the grocery store for you," the woman replied, while I blushed. "No. Honestly, it wasn't my setup. I would never do that. Honestly." "Yeah, sure, Romeo. I'll buy that? No. But yes, I would like that. To have dinner with both of you. My name is Cherry Roberts, by the way." "Really? It was that easy? Damn, I should have used that guy a long time ago," I said, and she and I giggled. We made a date for the following Saturday. She said she loved Italian food, and Maddie and I had some good recipes for the occasion. After we exchanged phone numbers and I gave her my address, Maddie and I turned to continue shopping. As we turned the corner to the aisle, Maddie and I threatened each other with our fists. "Yeah, no setup, right?" she called out to us. Finally, the next Saturday came. I swear the days couldn't have stretched any slower. After cleaning the apartment, Maddie and I got busy making homemade lasagna, garlic breadsticks and salad, and homemade tortoni for dessert. Cooking calmed my nerves because, truth be told, I was as nervous as a cat. After all, it had been over 20 years since my last date. And then it hit me, hard. It had been 20 years since my last date. Of course, all of those last dates had been with Tracy, and I had to think hard to remember who I dated before Tracy and I got together. I think it might have been Marianne Rizzo. The last I heard of her, she had married the guy she dated after me. I wondered if they were still married, or if her marriage had evolved in the same direction as mine. "Take it easy, kid," I finally said to myself. "It's a date, just a damn date, and you're already thinking about marriage." Not only me, but Maddie seemed enthusiastic. She was right beside me, helping me as we cleaned and then cooked. I had no idea that Cherry would be the first guest to come to our apartment who wasn't Mrs. Olivares or older than about 10 years old. Dinner went well, it seemed to me. It was a little nerve-wracking at first, but the presence of an 8-year-old is a great icebreaker. My mom wasn't married either. "Were you ever married, Cherry?" she muttered as I brought Cherry a glass of Galliano shortly after she arrived. Cherry blushed almost as much as I did at that question. Then she looked Maddie straight in the eye and said softly, "I was once married to a wonderful man, baby." But that was in the past. I saw the sadness and then pain reflected on her face as she answered the question. "Daddy was married too. And he has 2 other children besides me," Maddie continued. At this point, I decided I'd rather tell Cherry in Reader's Digest format about my marriage, my divorce, and how I became Maddie's father. She took it all calmly with a stoic expression on her face. Both she and Maddie wept a little when I moved on to the story of Maddie's mother not coming home. However, the sadness quickly passed for Maddie, who then asked Cherry about her name. That's a cool name, Cherry. Your parents must have been fun when you were a kid. Well, that's a pretty funny story, babe, Cherry replied. Actually, my real name is Marcella, and for short I was called Sella. One day at the grocery store, my little brother saw a box of chocolate-covered cherries called Sella, and after that he started calling me Cherry. It stuck, and now everyone calls me that, so that's what I'm called too. Well, it suits you a lot better than it suits Marcella, I cut in. I see thick, dark-rimmed glasses, masculine hands, and a firm ass. Oh, that's cruel, Cherry giggled in response. You will never, ever call me by my first name. Cherry stayed with us until Maddie went to bed at 9. Then she said it was time for her to leave too. I hoped she wasn't just being polite when she said she had a good time and that next time we should spend that time at her apartment. I gave her a quick peck on the lips as she walked out the door. For a brief moment, I thought I smelled arousal, but it had been so long that maybe I was just dreaming. I like her, Daddy. I think she'll be good for us, Maddie said as I closed the door. Had to admit, at least to myself, that the guy was right. For now. We had family dates 5 Saturdays in a row, and I think we all had a good time. However, I realized that I needed to try one-on-one time to see if it had any chance of success. Maddie took the news well when I told her that I was taking Cherry out to a restaurant, just the two of us, and that she would be spending the evening with Mrs. Olivares. I certainly wasn't going to leave Maddie home alone like her mother had done. I would never criticize Maddie's mother, but leaving an 8-year-old girl home alone while I went out on a date was not going to happen. Besides, I think both Maddie and I were well aware that the last time she had been left home alone, things had not turned out well. I made reservations at a nice steakhouse for our first date alone, as Maddie called it. I knew the mood would definitely be different when I showed up at Cherry's door to pick her up. She was wearing a somewhat tight silk dress, open in the front, so her lush 36 centimeters was clearly visible and short enough to make her short legs seem a little longer. She wore a little more makeup than usual and used a different perfume, sexier and spicier but not too strong. Damn, and I forgot to bring a stick! How the hell am I going to fight off all the other men? If you think that silver tongue is going to get you anywhere, well, you're probably right, she laughed back. We had a great dinner and enjoyed a more adult conversation without Maddie, although it was a little weird that she wasn't with me. You miss her now, don't you? Asked Cherry suddenly, looking me straight in the eye. Sort of, I admitted. Except for school and work, we're always together, and I don't mind one bit. You really miss the first two, don't you? She asked. Terrible, though not with the attitude I've had since I left. I know they're just kids, but they don't even try to see things from my point of view. My ex is really turning them against me. I think you're good with kids, I continued. If you don't mind me asking, why have you never had children? No, I'm not against it. We were considering this option at a time when I made the stupidest decision of my life. I disrespected and cheated on my husband, all for the thrill of illicit sex. I was a stupid, stupid bitch and ripped the heart out of the one person I cared about most in the world. That's a mistake I'll never make again if I ever get another chance to love someone like that again. Cherry's voice broke when she said the last sentence, but I caught every word she said in a barely audible whisper. Her eyes were full of tears, which she tried unsuccessfully to wipe away. I handed her a tissue and she gently blotted her eyes. I'm sorry if I made you go somewhere you didn't want to go, I said. I'd never talked to anyone about it before, she said. Not even my parents. I'm too ashamed of myself. All right, that's enough grown-up talk, I said. Let's blow this joint and see if you know how to move on the dance floor, Missy. Missy? How old do you think I am? 12? I actually thought you were 35, but I'm 44, so you're still a kid to me, I said. Really? 35? She said in a satisfied voice. I'm 42. I've been married 12 years, divorced 9 years. You have a very good effect on a girl's ego, sir. No way, you're only 2 years younger than me. I look like I could be your older brother, I laughed. I paid the bill, and we went to a dance club that Tracy and I sometimes frequented. I'm no Fred Astaire, but Tracy loved to dance, so one of the first things I did when we had extra money was to take some dance lessons. I quickly realized that sitting on the sidelines and watching your wife dance with other men was not the most enjoyable thing to do. Cherry was as light on her feet as she was in her eyes. We danced to slow and fast music for about 30 minutes before I needed a break. Cherry looked like she could have kept going, but she got up off the floor with me and we found a free table to occupy. I headed for the bar, and no sooner had I stepped away from the table than the first vulture swooped in. I watched them with the corners of my eyes, trying not to be too conspicuous. I saw Cherry smiling and laughing. The vulture must have been a little funny, but she didn't move away from the table. I was more than pleased. She sucked on her margarita as I held it out to her. Soon enough, Vulture Hash 2, a guy about 25 years old, showed up. He acknowledged my presence but still turned to Cherry and asked if she wanted to dance. "Excuse me, Slick, but I have a lady with me. I don't like to be disrespected, especially by children." I spoke softly but firmly and kept a smile on my face. However, the smile did not appear in my eyes, and the guy obviously realized that he had broken protocol. "Sorry, man, I didn't realize you two were dating," he wheezed before slipping away. We finished our drinks and went back to the dance floor, staying there for about 30 more minutes. Another guy tried to cut in, but he had the good sense to ask me first. When I told him no, he took it normally, held out his hand and said, "You can't blame the guy for trying. She's great." We went back to the table and had another drink. As we were finishing up, another vulture snuck up on us and asked my permission to dance with Cherry. I was tired, but decided that if she still wanted to dance, I would let her come out. She shook her head and I gave him the bad news. I drove her home and she suggested I come over for a while. It was only 10:30 and I agreed. We had a glass of wine each and talked easily for another hour. At that point, I got up and she got up with me. I wasn't sure how to close the deal, and I must have looked like the proverbial deer in headlights because she giggled and I started to enjoy hearing her. I blushed thickly and she realized I was in big trouble. "Don't worry, Alex. We're in no hurry to get anywhere, are we?" she cooed. 2 weeks later, in my bedroom, I interrupted my streak of zeros for 2 years. It wasn't something wild and crazy because Maddie was sleeping in the next room. I felt so good. I didn't last long, but Cherry seemed fine with that because before I got mine, I made sure she got hers. When we both got up to eat breakfast, she reached into my closet and came out of there wearing a white shirt that covered the bare essentials, but still looked incredibly sexy. We headed into the kitchen where we were soon joined by Maddie, who let out a squeal when she saw that Cherry was still with us. She ran up to her and threw herself into Cherry's arms, nearly knocking her to the floor. They hugged each other tightly, and both seemed genuinely happy to be in each other's arms. It was almost funny, and I rolled my eyes at the couple. "Pancakes! Pancakes!" they shouted in unison. "Chocolate chip pancakes!" I shouted back. 6 months later, Cherry moved in permanently, and we became the 21st century version of the Brady Bunch. Even though I was still paying child support and alimony, I was making a decent income, and Cherry was working at an accounting firm and making a decent income too. Maddie didn't lack for much, although she didn't ask for much. I guess when you grow up without much, almost anything can seem like a lot. I guess it's all relative. And while we may have been a modern version of the Brady Bunch, I think we looked like a modern version of the Odd Couple. In this case, the Odd Trio. We were black, white, and Hispanic, and we each had a different last name. Some of these problems were solved when I enrolled Maddie in 4th grade in the fall. I enrolled her as Maddie Ruiz Rogers. She was with me when I registered her, and her eyes got big when she saw what I had written. She didn't say anything until we got out of school, and then she practically exploded. "I could be Rogers like you?" "Really?" she squeaked. "Not legally, at least not for a few more years," I replied. "But according to Rogers' rules, you're eligible to join the club." At the word Rogers rules, I put air quotes, but that didn't deter Maddie in the least. She jumped into my arms and kissed me on the cheeks. After 30 seconds of celebration, Maddie stepped back and gave me a cold stare. I was a little taken aback until she spoke. "When can Cherry become Rogers?" she asked. "You know, that's a really good question. I'll have to give it some serious thought." And I meant it. In fact, on the anniversary of our first date, I asked Maddie to stay with Mrs. Olivares, And after work, I went to the jeweler I was buying gifts for Tracy from. Cherry said she'd be home late and would be eating dinner by herself, so I figured I had a couple hours to find the right ring. It was a little after 6 when I walked out of Jean Horowitz Jewelers, having just conceptualized a custom engagement ring with Jean's daughter, Jolene. After ordering pizza for Maddie, Mrs. Olivares, and me, I drove to my favorite pizza place located in a small shopping mall. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I glanced at the small but fashionable eatery located just a few steps away. And then my world ended for the second time. My Cherry walked into the restaurant under the arm of a handsome 40-year-old black guy. She looked lively and very happy. I stared after them, unable to move, or sigh, or think. I don't know how long I sat in the car before I realized I hadn't breathed in a while and felt like I was about to pass out. I took a deep breath, then another. Then I decided I needed to feed Maddie, so I walked into the pizza place and placed my order. I drove home in a stupor. I don't remember much about the evening, at least not until Cherry got home around 8. She was still animated and seemed to be in a great mood when she walked in the door. Hey! There's no way you'll guess who I ran into tonight. My brother John snuck into town without telling me, and after I finished work, he invited me over for dinner. I figured since you guys were eating pizza, it wouldn't hurt for me to grab a bite with him. She stopped talking when she saw the look on my face. Is that the story you want to tell? I asked quietly. Cherry looked shocked as the reality of my words scrolled through her brain. You went to Salvatore's for pizza today, and you saw me with him, didn't you? And you thought? You son of a bitch, she shouted at me. I was more than surprised. I expected guilt and remorse, not an attack. This must be some new way to apologize, I thought to myself. Cherry had never swore at me before, but I was beginning to realize that she might have a good reason. You don't even trust me enough to give me the benefit of the doubt, you bastard! I know I lost my husband because I cheated on him. I told you about it. I didn't hide anything. And I told you that I would never make that mistake again. I realize your ex-wife still has trust issues, but those are your issues with her. Don't you dare treat me so disrespectfully again, or I'll be out of here so fast it'll make your head spin. Mrs. Olivares must have quietly stepped out when Cherry exploded, and I watched Maddie slip away to her room. I wished the couch I was sitting on would swallow me, but it didn't. You're right, I said quietly. I let the mistrust Tracy planted in my head spill over into you. You're a separate entity, and if I can't realize that, then it's my fault and I don't deserve you. I wasn't going to tell her about the ring just yet, but after screwing up so badly, I had to play my best card. She grinned. If looks could kill, I don't think I'd be walking the earth by now. So, I know this is probably not the best time to do this, but I need to show you how much I care about you. Give me your left hand. She walked slowly toward me and held out her hand, palm up. I turned it palm down, put the piece of paper on her ring finger, and secured it with a rubber band from my shirt pocket. She looked puzzled, to say the least. What the? She said as she slipped the paper from her fingers, unfolded it, and began to read. You lousy asshole! She squealed. Really? Cherry then took my lips in the most passionate kiss I'd ever received, including anything Tracy had ever done. When we were done, she called Maddie to come out of her room. Look, baby, look, she said to Maddie, holding out a check for the ring. I'm going to be Rogers too. The squealing laughter of a pair of joyous females sounded at too high a pitch for the men to hear, but I managed to stay on my feet as they bounced around the room. When they dispersed, Cherry pressed a button on her cell phone and exclaimed loudly, You better get over here and meet your future brother-in-law. Maddie went and got Mrs. Olivares back so Cherry could show off her ring, and the apartment was still in a Christmas frenzy when Cherry's brother showed up. He was as handsome a man as Cherry was a beautiful woman. Looking at him, I couldn't even thank myself that he was her brother and not an admirer like I thought. We shook hands while Cherry introduced us, but then he reached forward and enclosed me in a bear hug. Handshakes are for friends, and while I want us to remain friends, hugs are for family, he said. They're also to show you that if you hurt her, I'll beat the life out of you. Got it? When he said the last phrase, he squeezed her a little harder. I was out of breath, and I realized what he was talking about. Uh-huh, I whispered back to him. Cherry briefly told him what had happened when I gave her the ring. He looked at me with mock surprise. I think he was, and said he was glad I was still alive. She looked at you with a laser death stare, didn't she? Asked John. Yes, she was killing people with that look. Both Maddie and Mrs. Olivares noted that they had the good sense to leave the room when they saw that look. Then he turned to Maddie, looked her over from head to toe, and said, "So, this is the famous Maddie Rogers. I've always wanted to have nephews and nieces. I think you'd be a great fit." Maddie smiled shyly, and then her face lit up like a sunny day. "Does that mean I can call you Mom?" she asked Cherry. Cherry didn't answer, crying. She reached for Maddie, and they stood in an embrace for a long time, each crying for a different reason. Even with Darlene's help, the state made us wait until Maddie was 16 before we could legally adopt her. By then, she could have already filed for emancipation and gone off on her own, but neither Cherry nor I worried about that happening. All the state did was sanction what Maddie, Cherry, and I had created years before. Family isn't always about blood and legal documents. And then out of nowhere, I hadn't heard a word from either of my kids since the last time we'd met over 6 years ago, so I was more than surprised when Haley was on the other end of the line. I didn't bother looking at the caller ID and just answered the phone with my usual, "Alex Rogers." "Daddy, it's me, Haley," she spoke quickly. "Please don't hang up." "Relax, kid. I would never hang up on you or your brother. Is something wrong?" "No, Dad. It's fine. Just fine. I'm getting married next month and I want to invite you to the wedding." I think I was just as shocked as anyone else. This was my little girl, and I was so removed from her life that I hadn't even met the man she was going to marry in just a month. The last time I talked to my kids, it was right after Ethan's 16th birthday. We went to Ethan's favorite restaurant for his birthday. As usual, neither of the kids were very talkative, despite my repeated attempts. Finally, right after we ordered dessert, Ethan came out with it. "Dad, I'm 16 now, and court-ordered visitation is over. Haley and I don't have to see you anymore if we don't want to. And we've talked it over, and we don't want to see you. You abandoned us to preserve your stupid pride. Well, you can take your pride and shove it up your ass." I have to hand it to my son. He was a great customer. Although he couldn't look me in the eye when he talked to me, he never raised his voice. Haley, for her part, shifted her gaze from Ethan to me and back again. I sighed, waiting for it to happen someday. It was Tracy's work. It had her fingerprints on it. "I assume you understand what wedding vows are and that your mother not only broke ours, but threw them in my face. But she has apparently convinced you both that I'm a bad guy, and nothing I say will change your mind. But for me, breaking my wedding vows isn't something I can just turn a blind eye to, like, say, breaking down the family car. It's about my soul, and while I knew that my leaving would hurt you two, staying would be even worse, because it would crush my soul and make me not the person I am. Then we wouldn't be the same, and you would realize that when you grew up and lived enough to see things for what they really are. It was your mother's mistake, and she did a good job of putting the blame on me. Well, I won't take the blame, if that's what you both want." Daddy, Haley said, bringing me back to the present. "Don't you want to come with me?" "Very much so, Haley kid. You know, I even put money aside for the day it happens," I replied. "You don't have to worry about money, Dad. Bob will take care of it." "Bob?" I asked. Wild guess, but we're talking about Robert Goldstein III, aren't we? There was a note of irritation in her voice, then it changed to pity. "You didn't know then, apparently. Mom married Bob about 6 years ago after we stopped seeing you," she said. "That bastard ruined my marriage, ruined my relationship with my kids, half ruined me financially, and then married my ex-wife. All because of my pride, Haley. Every time my son wants to apologize to me..." "Don't be like that, Dad. I'm not inviting you over to cause trouble. You're not going to give me away. You're not going to sit in front of the family. I just want you there, okay?" "Okay, Haley, on one small condition, that I can bring my family with me." "Your family?" "Yeah, even a loser like me has a family, Haley. I have a wonderful wife and an amazing daughter. You'll love them both if you ever spend any time with them." It was Haley's turn to reflect. I'd never told her or Ethan about Cherry and Maddie. Honestly, I didn't want their mother to know. "You have another child? Does she know about me and Ethan?" she asked almost serenely. Maddie is 16 years old. She was adopted. She and I have been together for 9 years. I almost literally found her on the street. She knows everything about you two, what we once had, and what we don't have anymore. She's fun and full of life. She's had setbacks too, and we were there for each other at a very difficult time in both of our lives, almost like a script. Well then, I look forward to meeting the rest of the family, Haley said, recovering from the shock. The wedding took place on Saturday night in a rather chic setting, as befitted the daughter of a rather successful lawyer. I have to hand it to old Bob, he didn't skimp on his stepdaughter. The service itself was held in a beautiful old church in town. The girls and I timed it so that we got there right before the service and sat in the last row. Yes, I noticed old friends and family, but by getting there right before the service, we didn't have to socialize ahead of time. And as Haley and Mark were leading the procession out of the church, I got a kiss on the forehead. We arrived at the reception in time enough to get a table at the back of the room, which, truth be told, wasn't fair to Cherry and Maddie, who had a girls' spa day on Friday and then both bought new dresses. Cherry's was sophisticated and sexy, and Maddie looked 16 when she first applied full makeup. Any father's nightmare. But they both respected my wishes and didn't complain when we sat down at the table after I stopped by the bar for a glass of wine for Cherry and me and a Coke for Maddie. As I expected, various friends from the old days started dropping by the table to say hello and chat as soon as they noticed me. Then Tracy's parents, Rhonda and William, stopped by. Rhonda cried as soon as she leaned in for a kiss. William hugged me even tighter than when Tracy and I were married. I introduced Cherry and Maddie. Rhonda and Bill looked a little awkward, but it was understandable. I had been married to their daughter for 18 years. Since I had no say and was not paying for the affair, I didn't think it was right to move around and work the crowd, so to speak. So the girls and I mostly stayed at the table when people approached us. But I'm no fool, and I saw the reactions of many people who knew me to being with a gorgeous black woman and a Latina princess. Particularly the reactions of the wives of former friends. You'd think I'd brought a trophy wife to the party. And just at that moment, Tracy and Bob, our hospitable hosts, showed up. Being married to someone for almost 20 years, you can understand all the nuances of their personality. And from the first moment Tracy saw Cherry, I knew she didn't like her. Maybe Cherry was too black? Maybe. Maybe Cherry was too pretty? Probably. Could Cherry have had a flat stomach, great legs, and looked 10 years younger than her years? Definitely. Could Cherry, for all that she had, have just ended up with one single unfaithful guy in the room? Hell yeah. With everything that was going on in her head with Cherry, Tracy didn't even pay much attention to the fact that we were seeing each other up close for the first time in 10 years. She almost literally woke up when I moved over and kissed her cheek in greeting. Oh, Alex, I'm sorry. I was having a little trouble navigating in those new heels, she apologized. No problem, babe. You look amazing, I lied. Come on, let's go meet the new family. I introduced Cherry, Maddie, Tracy, and Bob, shook Bob's hand as warmly as I could, and introduced him as the instrument of my future good fortune. Everyone but Maddie flinched when I said that, but my daughter threw me a sly look and squeezed my left elbow. Did I mention this kid is perceptive? We chatted for about 5 minutes, not saying anything until Tracy and Bob stepped away, and the bride and her new husband approached us. When Tracy and Bob walked away, Maddie shook her head slightly, indicating that she was no more happy to see them than I was to see them. My second daughter, my fiancée, greeted me much warmer than I expected. She wrapped me in a tight hug and started crying, while my new son-in-law, Cherry and Maddie, stood silently by my side. I was completely stunned by this and didn't know what to say when she finally let me go. I'm sorry, Daddy, for everything, she whispered. I never realized what you were getting at until I repeated my own vows about 2 hours ago. Just as I was saying my vows, it was like I was slapped in the face by what you went through when Mom cheated on you and broke her vows. I never understood. I blamed you and your damn pride, and so did Ethan. And now I get it. Completely. You were absolutely right to do what you did. And she was absolutely wrong to not only do what she did, but to blame it on you. How can I make up for the pain Ethan and I caused you? There was a lump the size of a soccer ball in my throat. I hadn't cried since I tore the cartilage in my knee playing soccer in 10th grade, but I was damn close to it, standing here with my family gathered around me. How about you first introduce me to that handsome stallion you made those vows with, and then do me the honor of dancing? I replied. Oh, yes, of course, she said, somewhat embarrassed. You haven't met the man of my dreams yet. Mark Westinghouse, meet your second father-in-law, Alex Rogers, my real father. We shook hands sincerely, and then I did my fatherly duty and threatened him with my life if he ever hurt my daughter. I introduced him and Haley to Cherry and Maddie, and while everyone was getting acquainted, the band started playing. Dad? Asked Haley, tilting her head toward the dance floor. Enchanted, I said, taking her hand. The crowd, which had started to buzz even louder when Haley greeted me, buzzed even louder when I escorted Haley to the dance floor. I realized I was starting to show Tracy and Bob at this point, but I had a lot of years to catch up on. The band was playing what I like to call children's music, and although I can't stand it, I knew how to dance to it thanks to being married to a goddess who loves to dance. Haley was shocked that her newly discovered father was such a Renaissance man, and we actually lasted 2 songs. By then, most of the audience had gathered around the two of us. When the second song ended, Haley gave me another big hug, the crowd applauded, and Cherry and Maddie were waiting for me with bright smiles on their faces. I took their hands and pulled them to the floor with me, and the 3 of us did our song, and everyone else joined us. Look at you, Mr. Rhythm, Cherry said in my ear as she stepped closer. Who knew giving your daughter away in marriage could be so much fun, I told her, turning quickly to Maddie. But let's wait a few more years. I'm not sure my heart can take this much fun. Unwrap me, old man, Maddie smiled back. All 3 of us stayed on the floor for 6 more songs. Then I left my girls, went to the bar for a Jack on the Rocks, and sat down at my table to relax. I watched Cherry and Maddie enjoying the dance floor, and I didn't notice Tracy come over and sit next to me at the table. She touched my shoulder, and I immediately knew whose touch it was. This was supposed to be our day, not mine and Bob's, Tracy said, leaning in close to my ear. You threw 18 good years away for what? Obviously, you didn't love me enough. I never once turned my head in her direction. No. Obviously, you didn't love me enough not to do it at all, especially since I told you what would happen if you did. You didn't love me enough or respect me enough. But you got Bob as a result of the deal, and he's a pretty good catch, I'd say. And I got Cherry and Maddie. To quote the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, you'll find what you need. You were a jerk then. You're a jerk now. Maybe, but I'm a happy asshole who hasn't lost a minute of sleep because of your bad decision. And no, I wasn't expecting an apology. I'm fine. Ethan came back into my life when he started a serious relationship with a woman a few years ago. It seems that fidelity is much easier to understand when you're in the game, so to speak. He called me out of the blue and said we needed to talk, so I invited him to the apartment. When I opened the door, he was carrying a bottle of Jack Daniel's Tennessee Honey. Haley said you really like these things, and she thought I should bring you a peace offering, he said, as I led him into the apartment. We'd only talked a little at Haley's wedding, and that was on shaky ground at best. That was over 2 years ago, and while Haley and I had reconciled, Ethan hadn't. I asked my girlfriend Sasha to be my wife, and it got me thinking about you and Mom. Haley has been telling me for a couple years now that the injured party in this case was you, not Mom, but I didn't realize that until Sasha and I had the big talk, and that included our feelings about fidelity. I'm sorry, Dad. I was a complete idiot. I get it now. I just didn't mean to hate Mom. I never asked you and Haley to pick sides, I replied. I just wanted you to know why I had to leave. Had to leave. Over the next few hours, Ethan and I talked about a lot of things, finishing off a bottle of whiskey. Cherry cooked a great dinner for all of us, and the 4 of us got to work. Ethan fell asleep on the couch in the living room because Cherry wouldn't let him drive his car after he'd shared a bottle of liquor with me. Cherry, Maddie, and I sat at the groom's family table at this wedding, along with a pregnant Haley and Mark and our first grandchild, 2-year-old Brent, who sat next to Tracy. That way, Tracy at least didn't feel left out because she was alone now. Bob had kicked her to the curb in favor of a trophy wife about a year ago. The kids kept me in the loop on Tracy's affairs, with occasional snippets of news about her. I told them both that there was no need to be a liaison between Tracy and me. We were adults, and if either of us wanted the other to know something, he could pick up the phone. Maddie flew in for the wedding. She is a freshman at the University of Michigan, but didn't want to miss her older brother's wedding, so I flew in with her. She, Ethan, and Haley have developed a strong relationship, so much so that they can banter with her, saying she's my favorite child. I find it very interesting to watch the three of them together. The argument that nurture is more important than nature when it comes to raising children seems to apply to us, because Maddie and I have an unbreakable bond that even Cherry has noted. While I wouldn't wish what we experienced in early childhood on anyone else, adversity has brought us a little closer than we might otherwise have been. Adversity has probably helped Cherry and I as well. We both know that you can never take anything for granted, and we cherish the time we have together while we sort out our new life as empty parents. I can tell you that it didn't take Cherry long to realize that an empty nest means that no one in the next room is overhearing anything, and she has loosened up a few degrees in the bedroom. Her screams of pleasure drive me wild and make me want to please her even more. There are mornings when we both go to work a little stiff and sore after a raucous night of play. When all the usual wedding reception hassles were over, Cherry and I headed to the dance floor. Maddie danced with one of Ethan's groomsmen too, but not before Ethan warned her not to mess with my father's favorite child, or else she'd have to pay. I grinned when he said that. I started to head back to the table after about half a dozen dances, but Maddie wanted to dance with me, so I stayed for one more. I noticed that Cherry and Tracy had nothing to say to each other, even though they were sitting within talking distance. "Can you feel the frost coming from across the room?" asked Maddie, finding herself within speaking distance. Insightful. When I finally returned to the table, Cherry stood up and joined Maddie on the dance floor. After a minute, I felt a touch on my shoulder. Obviously, we've gone for round 2, I thought. "Aren't you going to gloat about Bob leaving me?" asked Tracy, leaning over to him. "Not my circus. Not my monkeys," I replied. "I know this will probably surprise you, but I rarely think about you at all. I don't wish you harm, but I don't care about your life or what happens to it. We had 18 wonderful years together, and that was years ago. Now I have a new life, and I don't want to waste time thinking about the past, or what could have been." While we'd been talking, I'd been watching the dance floor, and now I turned to face Tracy. And that's when I saw her. Fear. Fear of living her retirement life alone. It was another factor she apparently hadn't considered all these years, because she thought I certainly wouldn't give in the face of her threats to ruin my life in a divorce. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I realized that she would have been trying to crush my soul if the roles had been reversed in this conversation. "You know I was an asshole then, and I still am," I said, getting up from the table and joining my girls on the dance floor.